Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome on stage your moderator and distinguished panelists.
So a very good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to our 2023 Per Jacobsson Foundation event. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Antoinette Saye, and in addition to my role as Deputy Managing Director at the IMF, I am also President of the Per Jacobsson Foundation. Now, the foundation focuses on taking forward the work of international cooperation in the monetary and economic fields, to which Mr. Jacobsson, who was a former managing director at the IMF, devoted his life. We do this by stimulating public discussions among leading global thinkers on economic issues of global priority and supporting research in these areas. Now, this year marks the 60th anniversary of the foundation. And it has been our tradition since 1964 that we organize such a gathering at the annual meetings. This year, though, we have taken a small detour from that tradition. Rather than a lecture, we decided to invite eminent thinkers to talk about how emerging markets, particularly those on the African continent, can build economic resilience in these very uncertain times. So as we heard in our discussions all week, the multiple challenges that confront the world, inflation, food security, rising levels of debt, high costs of servicing that debt, and dealing with the impact of climate change, are impacting emerging markets, and particularly those on the continent. Countries need to undertake reforms to build their resilience to these challenges. Yet many countries have very little policy space to do so. And this is a topic that has been very much at the center of discussions this week throughout the annual meetings. And we certainly have not exhausted it. I therefore very much look forward to this discussion today, in which we will hear the views of an eminent policymaker and an eminent development thought leader. So talking about resilience, let me recognize the incredible resolve of the Moroccans and of Morocco, having shown that resolve in the face of a very horrific tragedy. We're eternally grateful to Morocco for hosting us so warmly despite what they have endured. Let me also thank our staff at the IMF who have organized and made this event possible. And now allow me to introduce the chairman of the Per Jacobsson Foundation Board of Directors, Guillermo Ortiz, who will moderate today's event and introduce the panelists. Guillermo has chaired the foundation's board for the past 12 years, and the foundation has benefited enormously from his leadership, his vision, and his dedication. Guillermo has informed us that he will step down from his role at the end of this year, and a new chair will be appointed. And so on behalf of the board of directors of the foundation and its many supporters, Guillermo, let me take this opportunity to really express our gratitude to you for the investments you've made in the foundation with a long-enduring tenure of chair of our foundation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Guillermo. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Antoinette. It's been a privilege serving in the foundation for these last 12 years. We have had, if I recall, about 18 lectures and panels during these past 12 years. And as Antoinette was saying, this space, which has already lasted 60 years, I mean, not many institutions last 60 years, it has been a forum for discussion of international economic issues, both at the regional and global level, matters of central banking, finance, climate change, you name it. So I think that we owe it to the memory of Per Jacobsson to continue this tradition. So I'm very happy here to welcome my colleagues in this panel. And I will be very brief with their curriculums, otherwise I'll take most of the time of the panel. But my left is Lecha Kanyao, Governor of the South African Reserve Bank. He was appointed the governor for 2 consecutive terms in 2014-19. He served before as a deputy governor. He chairs a number of committees and working groups and so on at the BIS and in regional African organizations. I'm not going to name it because I will occupy most of the time. I just say that I met Lecha many years ago at the BIS, and I'm very happy to see him here again. Sir Masoud Ahmed, President of the Center for Global Development. He has been president since 2017, if I recall. Before joining the CGD, Masoud had more than a 3-decade career in international organizations, driving economic policy developments and so on in the World Bank, the IMF. He's a leading expert on international development finance and has as well served in a number of international committees and forums. They both studied in London, also Legend in South Africa, but we have a very promising panel here with this gentleman. So let me begin by recalling the characterization that Antoinette made regarding the situation of emerging markets in general, and it's resilience. The other word that I've heard a lot in the last few days is divergence. Means that not all emerging markets are created equal, and it is true that given the multiple shocks that we have been suffering, if you could, I just don't want to go through the whole list again, but I mean, we started with the pandemic, supply chain disruptions, and then the geopolitical problems, tensions, the invasion of Ukraine, you name it. So, I mean, the term has been coined as polyshocks, the convergence of multiple shocks in a short period of time, and this is what we're having. So it's true that emerging markets, particularly those in the sort of middle income range, have been pretty resilient. And, it is a little bit surprising that given the magnitude of the shocks, that we have had no major, problems of losing market access, except in a handful of countries. But yet, there are also a number of countries, particularly low-income countries, that are in a much more fragile state. So, talking about resilience should not lead to talk about complacency. Because on the other hand, you have the fragmentation. I mean, the report of the IMF mentions explicitly that countries have different fortunes. And in the case of emerging markets in general, the medium-term prospects are pretty dire. And this is apart from the impact of the pandemic in terms of loss of education, school years, the huge increase in poverty, almost 100 million people are more in poverty. The progress made in reducing income disparities has been halted and reversed in many cases. So this is a very mixed and difficult picture. So let me begin, with this question. What is your view on this assessment? In terms of resilience, fragmentation, and perhaps we can go on and talk about what's needed, going forward, the role of international organizations and so on. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Guillermo, and thanks, Antoinette, for those introductory remarks. When I was asked to be part of this panel, it says building economic resilience in uncertain times, I said, maybe this is what we should have asked some 3 or 4 years ago. And so I decided to put my own theme to this discussion, and it's rebuilding economic resilience rather than building one. Because as things stand, the aftermath of the COVID shock meant that the resilience of economies got seriously tested. And I just want to make the first three points, and I'm sure during the discussion we will get to that. What did we learn getting into the crisis? One is that those countries that had policy buffers coped better. And so the same old that you must have prudent macro remained. And so the countries that were within their inflation targets or below them, the countries that had fiscal buffers were able to respond to the crisis through fiscal action and through providing monetary support via the central banks. And I can say that in our region, my own country didn't have the fiscal buffers. So fiscal couldn't really come to the party. They tried, but they were really scratching on the surface. What we did have, though, were the monetary buffers. Inflation was on target. We still had a positive policy rate, and so we were able to rapidly adjust policy to get into that. Fiscal deteriorated, and which is why I said rebuilding resilience. Because you see, as the global economy reopened in 2021, inflation was starting to rise, and so we had to take steps to deal with inflation. And here, emerging markets were quick off the mark, and the Latin American central banks in particular moved much earlier than those that moved much earlier than the rest of us. We only started moving in November to adjust policy, and I think Brazil started earlier in April. So that was the one leg. So the central banks came to the party to provide support during the COVID-19 crisis. They were able to do that to the extent that they had the policy buffers. If you didn't have the policy buffers, it was a completely different story. But the point here was that there were all sorts of things. Those which couldn't do policy adjustment in that manner were left in all sorts of trouble. But there were also other things that got done. To the extent that there was market dysfunction, a number of countries started to use tools to reopen markets, and that was a useful thing. But not everybody could do that. Let me just mention fiscal, and then so that I can allow Masood to talk, was that then as the economy reopened, commodity prices were rising, and commodity exporters suddenly had revenue they didn't expect. And once again, it's how they started to use that. Did they use that to rebuild the policy space, or did they go and spend? And I can say from my country that we started the debate. maybe we shouldn't use this money to rebuild policy space. Maybe we'll use a third to rebuild policy space. We will use a third to continue to provide social support. And maybe we'll use a third to go and invest. And the attitude seemed to be that the commodity cycle is on an upswing once again, and it will be with us for a long time. It was not to be. And now we are back in a situation where we are asking the question. We could have built the buffers then, and then we could be using the space. We didn't. So now that is why I said we are going to have to rebuild the buffers. Yeah. Last point, and then we would come back to this, is that during that process, central banks came to the party, and because central banks came to the party, interest rates got depressed, treasuries got addicted to very cheap money, and they thought this was a permanent situation. And as the economies reopened, as inflation resurged, treasuries are finding themselves in an environment where borrowing costs are elevated. But there is another damage that was caused. The damage that was caused was that the era of cheap money actually led to a situation where policymakers postponed the most difficult structural reforms that were supposed to take place, because suddenly there was cheap money. And that is what we face. And the structural changes are going to be crucial. I mean, I think that earlier we had this thing, there would be 1 billion people under the age of 20 who will be joining the labor market in the next few years. Are we going to be able to absorb them? Absent structural reforms, we would not be able to.
Thank you, Lecha. Let me take a point that Lecha mentioned, Masood, and ask you the following. Lecha mentioned that this time around, very unusually, it was emerging markets that realized that inflation was not a temporary phenomenon that would just fade away with the restoration of supply chains and so on. So, central banks in Latin America started raising rates almost a year before the Fed. As a result of that, I mean, to me, it's very difficult to understand, why the governors of central banks in developed countries did not at least, see what was going on. Why are these guys raising rates? Maybe because they have lower credibility and they need to anchor expectations, whatever you name it, no? But the end result is that this tightening cycle has been extremely compressed. I think that we haven't seen, this kind of raises in interest rates, both policy and market interest rates, compressed in 1 year or a year and a half, in decades. So this obviously poses a number of challenges for financial stability and so on, but also, as I was saying, for emerging markets, that given the prospect for slower growth going forward and so on, how do you see this environment?
Thank you very much, Guillermo, and thank you very much, Antoinette, for inviting me to join. And I want to answer your question by building a bit on what Leseja said. See, I think I like what you started with, which is that we should be calling this rebuilding resilience. But another way I might think about it is that, we've been saying countries need to build resilience. It's a sort of standard line in IMF documents, right? I mean, if you look at VOs, we always put in that countries need to build resilience, use their buffers. How is it different now? What are we saying that's different? And I think you just drew a whole lot of lessons, including, I'll come to the point about the lessons that come from if you delay, in some cases, the tightening, then you have to do longer, harder to also make sure the expectations don't set in. And I think Latin American central banks were good at that in the sense. But I think what is different in two ways. One, if you listen to all of what Kristalina, Antoinette, your colleagues have been saying, you're saying we are entering into an era where shocks are going to be more frequent and deeper. So COVID was one, food was another, now there are political shocks. So the question then becomes, how does the process of building resilience at the national level and at the international level have to change to take into account this new state in which we are going to try and help build resilience? If there are going to be more frequent shocks, what do you need to do? Well, I think there are two lessons that come to me from that. One is you have to allow for larger and more quickly replenished buffers than you would have done in the past. Because in the past, you might have thought, well, you know, I get a shock, I'll be the only one, I'll find ways to deal with it. Now, if everybody's going to be hit by shocks because they affect more than one country, they come frequently, you need to be able to reflect that in the buffer. Now, that's easier said than done. Because if you're, particularly if you're a cash-strapped, low-income country, you're actually struggling to make the payments every week and every month, then you come along and say you've got to build even bigger buffers. I mean, that's okay, but it's just a reality we have to build into our accounting now. But the second thing is that the decision-making process for reacting to a shock has to be much more agile. And that's, you see, what we saw in the COVID response was that the countries that did well were the ones, or did relatively well, were the ones that had the mechanisms to be able to respond quickly. If you had already in place a digital infrastructure for reaching all large numbers of your households, you could make cash transfers more easily and help them buffer the impact. If you didn't, it was much harder because you were trying to set it up. So I would say the lesson that I draw from the shocks, and by the way, the same applies to the institutions, which is the central banks and the governments, in their ability to respond more quickly to these shocks. So I would say lesson number one is, you know, the size of the buffers probably end up being a bit larger and the processes need to be more agile. But the second thing I would say is it's not just about countries. It's about the international institutions that have been helping to countries to manage their economic and financial stability. Because now, if we accept the same line, that there are going to be more shocks, more frequent, then the natural question is, take the IMF, because, you know, we're talking about the IMF today, does the IMF have the right kind of facilities and tools to respond to the sorts of shocks we will be seeing more of, rather than to the idiosyncratic country-by-country problem, which used to come mostly because countries messed it up themselves over time on the fiscal or the financial side, and you end up with an imbalance that has to be corrected. IMF has a very good machinery for doing that. But now you get hit by a set of shocks. Does the IMF have the right instruments? So this maybe not, today is not the time to have a debate about what those instruments should be, but I think that's a question that we need to ask. Do the multilateral development banks have a different role to play in a more shock-prone world? That's another question to which I think we need to find an answer. And last thing I'll say is that, so one kind of resilience we've been talking about is in response to more frequent shocks. But the other way in which resilience is going to be different now is actually building in the ability to cope with predictable worsening of climate-related impact. So climate, there's nothing unpredictable about it. But, you know, it's pretty clear, it's happening, it's going to happen more and faster. The question is, how much are we building that in? And it's not just a macro issue. I'll give you a very simple example to close with. If you're building schools or hospitals today, let's say in Africa, your building design was meant to cope with 35-degree summers or 32-degree summers, right? Now the summers are going to be 42 degrees. Those hospital buildings and school buildings, will they be functional when it's much, much hotter outside? See, I think at this stage, in my personal view, I'm happy to be corrected, but my understanding is that if you went and talked to the people who run the schools and the health systems and say, how are you building into your design for future infrastructure the predictable impact of climate change on this environment, you would come away feeling that there's work to be done. So I think the second bit of resilience is now to make a serious, determined, across-the-board effort on building into our systems the consequence of predictable worsening as a result of climate change, which is different from what we have been thinking in the past. Because I think, to be fair, 5 years ago, we hadn't internalized what we have internalized now in terms of how predictable and how rapidly we are going to see the effect of worsening climate on us. So we stop with that.
Well, this is a very tall order, Sudnu. Not only we have to rebuild buffers and do it on a timely basis, as was mentioned, but also take into account the frequency of shocks and the overall overriding issue of climate change and the impact of that. So you have to finance development, you have to do buffers, you have to finance climate change. I mean, you are the central bank, you don't have to do that, but the government has to do that. And obviously, there is a role of international organizations. What can the IMF and the World Bank do? And back in 2008 and 2009, during the great financial crisis, the emergency was there, and action followed. The contingent credit line was put together in a matter of literally a couple of weeks. I had conversations at the outset with the managing director and deputy managing director. So it was put together very quickly. And I don't see the same kind of the sense of urgency and reaction. So this is to deal with short-term problems derived from the shocks. Now, on the question of financing climate change and this super expensive horizon that we have going forward, it's essential that the private sector participates and capital markets. So obviously institutions, particularly the World Bank, have to be taking part of the risk in these projects. Otherwise, it will be very difficult for private capital markets to finance. But anyway, how do you see the role of both IMF, the World Bank, and the other multilateral institutions in this problem?
I think that it just links from what Masood was saying about the role of the global institutions. If one was to ask developing countries all to build buffers, and one of the big shock that we had was that during the lockdown, countries experienced capital outflows. If you didn't have reserves, you could have easily faced a balance of payment crisis. Now, not all of us can self-insure, so we clearly need a collective pooling of insurance. And those who have heard me say, I have said this a couple of times before. So 2008, global financial crisis, and then we say that we need the IMF to be resourced. The IMF says we need permanent resources. It says, no, you are not getting permanent resources. We are going to give you temporary resources. Gave them temporary resources. And then as we were going through we thought that we have conquered the global financial crisis, and there was a big debate, we should be withdrawing these temporary resources. And we said, no, but the IMF says it needs permanent resources. Enter COVID. It had to take COVID to convince us that we must put more resources into the IMF. Are we going to wait for another shock of that magnitude before we reach an agreement that says that for us to have this collective insurance scheme that many countries that can afford could utilize, that we still engage in a debate about should we be having this? The lesson from COVID had been that we talked about buffers, but we are going to have to build redundancies because we saw it with the global supply chains. And one of those redundancies that we might have to build is resources in the IMF that might not be required now, but we've got to build that redundancy because we do not know when we would actually need that, we will need that redundancy. And this redundancy, sometimes you ask the question, maybe they might be in the private sector, but at the end of the day, this becomes a public good that we are going to have to do. Just a word about climate and climate finance and the choices that you have talked about that we are going to have to finance development. We are going to do this. And then you said not the central banks, which I agree with you. But as treasuries run out of financing resources, they're starting to look at the treasury and they're starting to get crazy ideas because they think that maybe these chaps, you know, they have been so good, they could tame inflation. They might just tame our financing problems too. And therein lies the problem, that we might just be looking into institutions that have not been designed for a particular purpose, but because they have been successful in dealing with inflation, society is starting to have an inflated expectation of what central banks can actually do. And that becomes a risk. And so we're dealing with climate and the just energy transition. I'll use the example of South Africa. South Africa has been offered these resources, $8.5 billion to finance the just energy transition because our energy is based on coal. And just the biggest chunk of those resources are debt. Now, we are sitting on a debt to GDP of 70%, and you are saying you are offering us resources to do a just transition, and the only resources you can offer us is to pile us with more debt. At the time when we say there is a debt problem, not just in emerging markets, there is a debt problem in the advanced economies. So how are you going to finance the just energy transition by piling countries with more debt? And therein lies the thing, and you said the private sector must be coming in, and it's important then that we look at almost a bigger chunk of the just energy transition being financed through non-debt creating resources. Otherwise, there is no just energy transition. And lastly, that in that climate financing, we have got a difficult conversation to have with societies about this just energy transition when you are faced with the following. So listened to the Minister of Finance from Germany, says he's got the most efficient coal-fired power stations, and he's going to have to shut them down and spend money to replace them with something else without adding a single megawatt to his grid. Well, South Africa is having to shut down coal-fired power stations at the time when we have got a shortage of electricity. What conversation do we have with the South African society? What mitigations do you put in place so that they stay on course for that? And if you do not put those mitigations in place, the public could justifiably say, there is no just in this JET, and we are going to have problems. And to complicate matters, as we were shutting down these coal-powered power stations, Europe was facing an energy shock with the war in Ukraine. And what does Europe do? They say to South Africa, send us the coal. So now we are saying to the South Africans, shut down the coal-powered fire stations. Europe says, send us the coal. And you say, why do you want the coal? It says energy security. What makes European energy security more important than African energy security? So you are having that conversation, and the discourse have got to be a fair conversation that says, we have got one planet. It doesn't help that others are saying, we are not polluting and you are polluting, and because you are polluting, I'm going to impose some carbon entry tax on the goods that you are saying. We have got one planet. So if we continue, we will all suffer global warming. So can we have a multilateral approach that is fair, that would ensure that not just countries becoming resilient, that the global system becomes resilient?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Masood, building on this, we were talking about. I think when we talk about climate change and the investment needed, the numbers are mind-boggling. At the time when, as you mentioned, debt levels are in both emerging markets and developed markets are at historical highs by far. The global debt levels are some 30%, 25-30% higher than before the pandemic, and substantially higher than the previous financial crisis in 2000. So, as one example, for example, the World Bank, it's widely suspect that the balance sheet of the World Bank is not being used effectively.
Right.
The firing power should be a lot greater without being exposing for downgrades or anything. So how do you see the risk mitigation part of the project so we can get the capital markets to finance the green transition?
Thank you very much. Let me just come exactly to that issue of how can we get the multilateral development banks? What role can they play? Mm-hmm. And let's take the World Bank as an example, but the same thing applies to all the multilateral development banks in varying degrees, the regional banks also. And yesterday, we released a report which is exactly about the role of the multilateral development banks. It's produced by an independent group that's co-chaired by Larry Summers and N.K. Singh on the G20 website. It's on the CGD website. If you want to, take a look at it. It'll go into a lot more detail. But the core point of it, which is what I want to say now, is that for the multilateral development banks, there are really three things that they have to do to respond. The first is that they have to explicitly take on board that it is part of their job to help deal with global challenges, and that should be, therefore, translated into their business processes so that they're helping countries dealing with climate, with pandemics, in a much more systematic way than by an add-on at the moment. You've noticed the World Bank just agreed a new vision statement for itself. It used to be eliminating poverty and shared prosperity. Now it's ending poverty on a livable planet. These are all words, but the essence of it is to reflect the fact that the livability of the planet is part of what we need to achieve. And they've also, as a result, now got to translate that into what does it mean? It's nice to have the vision, but in practice. Second thing, they have to be able to do this at a much larger scale to have the impact. And what the report is saying is that we should aim for them to be 3 times the MDBs, to be 3 times the current size of their operations by the end of this decade. And then the third thing is, and how do you finance this? Your question? You can finance about half of the increase from better use of their existing balance sheets and by putting in the kinds of innovative schemes that some shareholders are already doing. The Germans are giving them some extra money as a long-term loan. The US is offering to, once they get it through Congress, a guarantee that will help them to scale up. So these things will get you halfway. But the other half has to be through an increase in their basic capital. Because without an increase in capital, you're not going to get there. And the third thing is that they have to shift their focus only from what they lend to how they help other private money to come in, and mobilizing private capital, at least as much again as they do now, is part of what they need to do to get to that outcome. So that's the sort of agenda. But the point I want to leave you with, look, the biggest problem we now face is not that we don't know what to do. You know, we have a pretty clear idea of what needs to be done at the country level, at the international level. And at one level, you come into meetings. The higher you go in the food chain, the more the meetings talk about big challenges and the global solutions and the need for global cooperation. This is a discontinuity. This is the moment for us to seize it. But as you start coming down and you look at the people who are actually making the day-to-day decisions in national governments, many of whom sit on the boards of these different institutions, then the degree of conservatism starts to grow. So you might say at one level that the IMF should develop a big safety net to help countries deal with shocks. But when the IMF is actually designing that safety net, if history is anything to go by, it will end up being forced more and more to tighten the measures, so that, the way I look at it, 80% of the people for whom the safety net is meant won't actually be eligible to use it, because it'll just be for the ones who are very well-managed, tightly run economies. Now, I hope that's not the case, but the basic issue here is a lack of coherence between the recognition of the challenge as being enormous, the recognition of the need to act at scale and in ways that are very different from the past. I mean, JET is another example. If you listen to the rhetoric about JETs, it's one level. But when you come right down to how much grant money is actually coming into instead of the 8.5 billion, you see that by the time it actually gets done, it's slow and it gets whittled down. So the sense of urgency has to run up and down the system, and it has to run across the institutions. And I think until we crack that, we will keep going around a bit in circles in terms of more and more eloquent statements about the nature of the problem and the need for collective discontinuity response, but a little bit harder to follow through.
Yeah. Well, on this note, since we have about 10 minutes to go, let's open it to the public. And if you have any questions, please raise your hand. You'll get a microphone. Please state your name and organization. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Usman Mandeng, I'm with Accenture. I'd like to ask you, the IMF. The IMF has about a trillion of financial resources and has credit outstanding today of about 130 billion. Is it fair to argue that the IMF simply is not able to mobilize its balance sheet and help countries which clearly, as you stated, are in distress? Giving more money to the institution could be more of the same, namely an inability to mobilize resources that apparently many countries are needing. Thank you.
Well, you both like to comment on that.
Look, I mean, I think there's two parts to that answer. One, I think the IMF should be moving more money, right, of the money that it's got. And I think in the past year or so, there's been, in the early part of this crisis, a lot of countries didn't approach the IMF because At that time, market access was easier. They were able to get money. Now it's going to get harder, and I think they'll come to the IMF. So I hope that a year from now, that number will be 3 times larger. The second part of it is that it relates a bit to this point I was making earlier, which is we have to look not only at the size of the balance sheet, but the conditions that enable those resources to be used. And going forward, I really do feel that we'll have to think harder about whether the conditions reflect the nature of the shocks which these countries will have. But the discussion about the IMF quotas, which is where this is all materializing right now, is not just a discussion about the size of the balance sheet, but about the composition of the balance sheet. And by substituting quota resources, even if you reduce the amount of the credit lines the IMF can draw upon from its members, you actually strengthen the balance sheet because it's a reflection of what you might call the equity of the IMF. But your core criticism that the IMF should be making more of its funds available to more of its members faster is one that I have a lot of sympathy for.
Would you like to comment? Another question?
Thank you. Nicholas Wan, Swiss Think. With the talk about the multilaterals providing more of the financing, just your thoughts on this one particular point. Very important, I think we all know, anyone who's worked with the multilaterals, very important to their business model is this idea of preferred creditor treatment, right? That when countries in particular get into problems with the private sector creditors and perhaps restructure debt with the private sector creditors, they won't restructure it, or at least they will eventually pay in full to the multilaterals, and so they're treated differently. As a result of this, the multilaterals obtain better financing rates, they're considered better credits, this helps them in their operating model. But the point is, if we want the multilaterals providing a greater share of the financing in the world, and we want the preferred creditor treatment to continue, then by definition, we're going to make more of the world's debt unrestructurable. So is there a balancing act at some point? What do you think about this?
You want to take that later?
That would be an interesting one. But there are 3 aspects to what you have raised. One is that from what you are saying, you are presuming that all future financing must be debt financing, which I have a problem with. We actually need more equity financing than debt financing because we already have a debt problem. That's the first point. The second point is that actually multilaterals play a very important role in many respects that things that the private sector cannot do. The private sector cannot work with a country and design a policy program and say, this is what you are going to have to do. And so credit must be given to the multilaterals because they are able to do that. Third is, I actually think we need to look at the multilaterals and say, in many instances, should they be playing a role of preparing projects for the private sector to be coming in rather than them taking them on their own balance sheet themselves? And that is an aspect that I do not think we have explored adequately, and is actually a very important route of actually crowding in the private sector.
I think we have time for one more question.
Bernard Snow of the Robert Triffin International Association. Do you see a new allocation of SDRs, and perhaps allocations of SDRs that would be given according to a different distribution system, not necessarily in line with the quota, as part of the solution to those challenges? Thank you.
Well, let me just make a brief comment on that. I mean, the SDR allocation is established in the bylaws and by quotas, so there's not a lot of room to move there. But the recycling of the SDRs, which was, one of the bigger aims in the last allocation, has gone, maybe less than halfway than expected. So, but this is a matter of political will and negotiations, But I don't know if you want to.
Definitely,
Yeah.
it's a matter of political will, but I just want to offer the following. We need the resources, we need them now. And if we are going to wait for a new formula and allocations and so forth, we know that process is going to take us a long time. We are not going to get the resources. Can we stage these things? Can we get the resources into the fund, build the necessary buffers or redundancies so that the IMF has got the firepower to assume its role at the center of the global financial safety net with adequate resourcing? We are getting into the next review of the quotas. Realignment of the quotas have got to take place. And we shouldn't allow the realignment to stop the resourcing of the IMF. And that would be how I would actually view it.
Masood, you have the last word.
Look, I don't have anything to add on that, Bernard. I mean, if you want my view, I think it's not likely to happen in the next couple of years at least. But let me just end with saying this. I think we have to move from talking about the problem and talking about big solutions, many solutions, to picking the ones that we want to go forward with and then delivering them with urgency. Because my biggest worry is that we are better and better at analyzing the problem, but we are not making the urgent response, even on the smaller things that don't solve everything, but they actually make a difference in the near term. I mean, Lesecha, as he just said, he needs resources in the near term, and so what can we do to find quick responses?
We cannot wait for a change in the international financial architecture.
I'm one of the people who wants to move with and make things work better now rather than the grand redesign. We haven't even talked about how difficult it would be to have a grand redesign in the current geopolitical situation. So
that's something that we haven't talked about, but we don't have time anymore. So let me bring this panel to a close and thank Masood and Lacha for their comments, and thank you very much for attending.